People, what's good? It's been a little bit. Um, who am I? I'm Stuby Kas. Who's in the chat? Shep Diggity. We also have Buddhika Bellana, who's actually joining us today. Let me get him on. Yeah. Hello, how are you?
Good. How you doing? Can you hear me fine?
I can hear you good. You can hear me well as well, right? All right, cool. So, welcome to this 20th episode of Freestyle Fridays, hosted by Life is a Freestyle. I am Stuby Kas, your host. And today I have Buddhika Bellana, who is a postdoctoral fellow of psychological and brain sciences at Johns Hopkins University. That's extremely big. And I want to welcome you on this Freestyle Friday to talk to us today about storytelling and how that actually affects the actual kind of neural pathways and how we actually end up thinking and reasoning and realizing the life around us.
Sure, I'll do my best.
Yeah. I will too. You know what I'm saying? Like that's all we can do. That is the whole premise, right? So getting right into it then. The premise, of course, being that life is a freestyle. How do you feel about that metaphor? How does it resonate with you? Life is a freestyle.
I like it. I like the metaphor. I think it's really interesting. The part I was thinking about it, and I think the part that sticks out to me is kind of like maybe a misconception about what freestyle is from the outside. And that's the idea that it's entirely novel. Like you're just like coming up with stuff that's unheard of, that you've never thought of before.
Right.
But instead, my experience and notion of like freestyling, what that entails is like taking bits and elements of stuff that you had thought of and little riffs almost, and kind of like recombining them in interesting and creative ways. And I think life is kind of like that too. You have like certain constraints that you're operating within, and then you're trying to combine what you have available to you and can mix it up in interesting and different novel ways to maybe come up with interesting and new ideas, but you're still working from these like core elements and these like restrictions, these limitations. So it's not like something that's completely novel. When you're living, your goals are not to, just create something that's like completely unheard of, but instead maybe a more reasonable and practical and probably true goal is to like take the elements that you have and just recombine them in interesting ways and maybe learn new things in the process.
Yeah, definitely. That's a beautiful explanation and a beautiful insight. Working with what you got, you know what I mean? Like that's extremely important, and it's a skill that unfortunately everybody doesn't have right away. You kind of have to figure it out along the way. Some people think that everything is extremely planned and that's the way that life goes, and others of us, we figure it out along the way that hey, sometimes you just have to juggle certain things. So as a cognitive neuroscientist, you study how stories change our brains. They also change our spontaneous thoughts and the way that we think. So how did you come into this line of study?
Yeah, kind of like the latter group of people that you described, kind of figuring it out on my way. So I started, in undergrad, I did psychology, but I ended up doing psychology. I actually was doing a few other things also, like French and theater. But then I kind of took, in my third year, just took a course on psychobiology, so the biology of the mind. And that had a lot of focus on the brain. And I just thought that was the craziest and coolest thing, to have this physical organ, this thing that's fat in our head. And our mental experience, like love and just everything that we, see and dream and think about, to some extent, our brain plays a big role in that. And and the fact that there are people, scientists, who think about how this piece of biological tissue, this organ, can produce our mental experience. I was just fascinated by that idea.
Yeah.
So from that kind of, I ended up finding myself kind of doing a PhD in memory and studying how we remember things. And then as I moved through that and actually experienced doing research and studying these kinds of, crazy psychological phenomena, rich, interesting psychological phenomena, I realized that the thing I was really interested in was not learning or memory in particular, but instead how we make sense of our environments, how we understand and take this rich experience that we, see in our lives and then make sense of it enough to be able to answer someone's question when they say, how was your day? You have to like take all of this like almost like infinite amount of information and make sense of it into some kind of form that's communicable and comprehensible to both yourself and others. And I think that's a really interesting thing to study. And as I kind of learned that that was what I was interested in by doing research, I tried to do that kind of research.
Yeah, yeah. It's very good for people to follow the things that are very intriguing to them, things that they're curious about. And you talk about you're curious about what it means to understand something deeply. You mentioned that on your website. What are the lesser known benefits of understanding something deeply that maybe a lot of people don't necessarily take into consideration?
I think understanding something deeply is like it's maybe not necessarily prioritized. For example, when you go to school and you're learning information for a test, typically how you approach that kind of information, you're just trying to like memorize it so you have something to answer some ability to answer your test effectively. That's kind of like the goal of what you're trying to do. But deep understanding, I feel, what it allows you to do is something just to draw connections across different elements of experience. So maybe see a relationship between stuff that you already knew and this new piece of information that you're learning, even if those connections are kind of outlandish. And I think what deep understanding kind of maybe emphasizes is like the aspect of like this creative associations, which is kind of really a big critical piece of like freestyling. It's just the fact that you're able to take this information that you might not, that you're learning, and figure out a way to contextualize it, figure out how it fits or relates to all the other things that you know. And that kind of learning, I think, helps you actually form more deeper and more robust memories, so you can keep them in your mind for longer and actually build off of that, rather than when you like memorize information and that kind of fades away after you do a test.
Right, right. Shep Diggity in the comments mentions synthesis, which is a very interesting thing there, because, you're not only synthesizing what you know with, what you see, but you're also maybe synthesizing things together creatively to create something that is perceivably new or at least novel, so that you can, create art, or like you said, have conversations that have nuance to them and things like that, and kind of add your own personality to something that would otherwise be kind of a standardized way of speaking or a way of creating or communicating. So yes, definitely synthesis and, having that kind of stockade of, associations, so that you can kind of pull from those at your own whim and pull from them, how you see fit in terms of, situational awareness and things like that. So definitely.
And I think like that is not something that's just like kind of ephemeral. It's not like something that doesn't matter. That actually helps you learn. That's how we learn. Even if those connections are kind of like your own idiosyncratic ones that you came up with, that's kind of like how you make sense of how we make sense of the world around us. So I think it plays a really important role, that kind of synthesis that I see, combination of known elements, like taking those things and using them to contextualize new information, even if it's outlandish, I think is a really important way of how we make sense of the world around us and learn.
Yeah, indeed. So what part of what we do at Life is a Freestyle, our entire group of, kind of like rappers and researchers and just kind of general nerds, people that are interested in cognitive sciences and things like that, we try to answer the question, what is freestyle? Because, when we break down this metaphor, you have two things. You have life and you have freestyle, and the association between them. And so we think about what is freestyle. Everybody more or less kind of knows what we mean when we say life. But generally speaking, everybody doesn't really know what freestyle is, even though a lot of people do it anyway. Like you said, it just kind of naturally happens. So can you tell me, what is a story, and what role does freestyle have in creating stories?
It's a tough question. So currently there's like a lot of debate amongst narratologists, psychologists, even people like authors and readers about what actually a story is.
Real quick, can you tell me what that first scientist is again? I heard it for the first time.
Narratologist.
Neurotologist.
Narratologist.
Narratologist.
So like narratives. So
okay.
studying narratives can be referred to as narratology.
Nice.
And narratologists.
Everybody learned something today. Yay!
But like, yeah, so the people who are studying stories, narratologists and psychologists, everyone, it's quite difficult to define what exactly is a story and what is not a story. So the simplest definition usually is something that has a beginning, middle, and end. There's like an arc, a shape kind of to story information, or something that has a sequence of events that are causally related to one another. However, that's kind of a little bit liberal. Like, for example, a recipe is a sequence of causal events linked from one to another that are unfolding in time, but I don't know if a recipe would fall into the category of a story. So it's difficult to really define exactly what or precisely what it is, but what I would say an important component of what makes something a story is that it deals with like human experience, that it has characters and agents who are doing things in these situations, and then what is happening in these events matters for the lives of these characters and lives of these people. And we, as the reader, kind of we care about what is happening to these characters and people. So some kind of sequence of events that are unfolding in time, but that are specifically about human experience and human life experience. And I think that's probably one of the core features that makes something a story rather than just like a sequence of events.
Right. And it's very important to note there that, the human experience is the most relatable thing to all human beings across the board. So, while there may be stories about certain things that everybody can't relate to or whatever, at the end of the day, if the core element taps into that human experience, that baseline, then I think that it becomes that much more relatable and that much more, relevant, I guess you could say, I guess relevant is the best word, so that you could kind of use it and synthesize it into, your knowledge and your usage of, associations in the future.
Also, like, I think to build on that, it's the idea that we as people are experts when it comes to stories, when it comes to like human experience. We know what that's like. We've put in all the years of our life of practicing that.
Right.
And that's
our life is a story, right?
That's a big part of it. Like, understand how we, like, the experience in the world might not necessarily be a story, but when we take it and synthesize it to understand it and turn it into some kind of communicable shape or form so that I can convey it to you, for example, that becomes a lot more story-like. And that transformation from experience to something like a story-like is a pretty interesting one. But I think, it's just like the fact that we are by default experts when it comes to stories. And we're not experts when it comes to that many other things. But therefore, when someone talks about their experience and someone else can listen to it, they can actually take that information and really make sense of it in a way that experts, for example, can make sense of the things that they're experts in. But by virtue of being people, we tend to be experts when it comes to human experience and stories. And to get back to your point about the role of freestyling in that, it's an interesting one. I think storytelling at its root often came from this idea of like oral storytelling, like not necessarily like well-practiced written storytelling, but instead telling people about what had been happening that day, or in conveying experiences to your community by spoken word. And I think that tends to lend itself more so to kind of freestyling, ad-libbing, responding to your audience, seeing if like they're understanding you or not, and then depending on that, titrating how you're communicating to make sure it lands for them.
Making sure you're adding the context where needed and
exactly.
Coloring things as needed to kind of go with the audience's palette.
Exactly, and that's kind of more difficult when you're writing or typing or doing something like that, because you're not like freestyling when you're freestyling in a cipher. There's people, you're building off of that, the energy of what's around you, and I think storytelling, oral storytelling, is a great example of doing something very similar.
Indeed. Very, very, very good stuff. One thing that we might have skipped past at the very beginning is that we try to get to 16 questions, which we call 16 bars. for this to be Freestyle Friday. And so, obviously, you've definitely dropped a series of bars thus far, and we're going to keep going here. But I just want to, thank you again for coming on and dropping these bars so far. Buddhika Bellana, postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. I just wanted to keep it going for the people who are coming in a little late. Let everybody know who you are. So, as we continue, why do we understand stories more readily than other kinds of information? And I think you kind of touched on this a little bit, but other pieces of information might also relate to the human experience in a way. But clearly, as you mentioned, there's something about putting the thread of relatable human experience into story format. But can you speak to that a little bit more as it pertains to that versus some other kind of information that you get that may or may not stick as easily?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question, and one that I'm very motivated by. One thing to think about, to take a step away from stories first and maybe come back to it, is that there's certain kind of information, even outside of the shape of stories, that we learn better than others, or at least in the ways that we can engage with information in different ways so that we can learn it better or worse. So for example, there's this framework in psychology referred to as levels of processing. And it's this idea that you can learn information at different levels of representation. So for example, if I gave you a list of words and asked you to make a decision about this list of words, for example, I will ask you if a word rhymes with the word lime, for example, and I gave you a list of words, you would say yes or no to the list of words, right? And I could test your memory for that after. And your memory would be, okay, but if I gave you a list of words and asked you, instead of to think about their phonetics, how they sound, to think about what they mean. For example, does this, the word I tell you is a paperclip, and I'll ask you, does it fit inside of a shoebox? And you will say,
yes.
Okay. So then what that requires you to do is think about what the sound means, imagine what a paperclip looks like, and then see how it fits. So you're dealing more so than just saying yes or no to whether paperclip rhymes with lime. You're having to actually think about what paperclip means.
There's a whole cognitive sequence there, yeah.
Exactly. And by accessing those associations, the semantics, the meaning of that word, we tend to find that your memory for those words is better. So what this suggests is that, and for example, it's even worse if you were just to see a list of words and decide if the word was italicized or not, or capitalized or not. So there's these different levels with which you can understand information, and meaning, what things mean to us, seems to be the stickiest or most powerful of all when it comes to learning information. This is information that's not even stories. And then if you take that and then you ask yourself, how are stories working maybe? Given that I know that if I think about what paperclip means, what that entails is me thinking about all the associations I have to paperclip to kind of understand what this sound means. But what you're doing with stories are comprised, for example, of events. And the events in a story, you're not just thinking about what each event means. You are doing that, but you're also thinking about how each event relates to one another. You're kind of creating a web of connections of meaning. And furthermore, beyond just drawing those connections between random elements of random events, you're also trying to understand what the consequences are socially in the situation of certain events happening. And given that you're doing all that, that's kind of meaning squared. It's an exponential version of just attending to meaning. And if we really care about meaning, maybe stories are just a perfect way to really isolate and even emphasize our focus on meaning in a way that kind of helps us learn. So this is something that's being actively studied, and it's not necessarily obvious yet why that's the case. But I think the notion that we really can benefit from attending to the meaning of things might be a window into why stories are particularly a useful form of information for us.
Yeah, I heard from this kind of group, seminar that I was in one time that we are meaning-making machines, and we will make meaning out of anything. But so the funny thing that you mentioned there is when we hear a story, not only do we kind of put the meaning together from the story elements, in the kind of capsule of the story itself, but then we also apply it to how does it apply to our lives? How does it resonate with us? And,
Totally.
have we seen, examples of this that we can then kind of reinforce our understanding of the story with, and we can use the story to reinforce our understandings of those things outside the story with. So all of these kind of pathways of meaning are almost like reinforcing those pathways neurologically, perhaps, and so that's definitely very, very interesting stuff. So speaking of that, what happens in our brains when we're hearing stories? And does the same apply when listening to something like rap music, which contains a lot of, storytelling?
Yeah, so that's really interesting stuff. So one of the, I would say, the most interesting, or one of the really interesting characteristics that stories have in terms of the brain is their ability to synchronize our brains. And I'll be specific about what I mean by that. So imagine you were in a room and it was just like pitch black, and then there was a light that would just flash like every 30 seconds or something. If I had a way of measuring your brain activity, for example, if you happen to be like in a magnetic resonance imaging, functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, brain scanner, or some other way, just say theoretically, I was able to like measure activity in your visual cortex, the part of your brain that's particularly important for visual information. I would see that brain activity would kind of increase when there was like this flash of light. So if I was in the room and I was also seeing the flashes at the same time, my brain activity in my visual cortex would be synchronized with yours. They would be going up and down at the same periods of time. But like in our daily lives, there's no reason for any part of my brain to be synchronized with any part of your brain. We're actively communicating with one another.
Right.
And what researchers have done, particularly some of my supervisors, Chris Honey and Janice Chen, who are at Hopkins, and their collaborators, have done a lot of work where they have people watch stories in a brain scanner, in the scanner. And what they're doing is looking at how different parts of the brain synchronize with one another. And what they find is that activity in the brain, large parts of the brain, are synchronous. They fluctuate together across people when they're watching the same story. And interestingly, when you kind of scramble the story to make it make less sense. So for example, if you're watching a movie and then you shuffle the order of events or shuffle the order of frames, or if you're listening to a story and you shuffle like the order of sentences or shuffle the order of paragraphs or shuffle the order of words, what you see is certain regions start to drop off in terms of they're no longer showing synchrony. The parts of your brain that are, for example, associated with hearing information, if you're listening to a story, even if you're hearing words, they're going to still be synchronized between you and I because we're still hearing things that are, at the same time. But the deeper parts of the brain associated with meaning and understanding maybe, don't really show synchrony anymore when you're listening to a scrambled story. So what that suggests is like stories are able to synchronize parts of our brain that aren't always synchronized, and maybe these parts of the brain are important in contributing to our ability to form meaning from the world around us, which stories kind of do. And there's really interesting studies that kind of have people listening to stories in different languages. So for example, English speakers listening to a story in English and Russian speakers listening to the same story but in Russian. And what you find is you can find synchrony in these deeper brain areas. They're often referred to as the default mode network. But these regions show synchrony across people listening to stories in different languages. And if you think about it, the sounds are completely different. The information that they're hearing are very different. However, you can find in these default mode network areas synchrony, suggesting that the meaning of the story is still unfolding in time in the same way across people. So to kind of come back, I would say stories are really cool because they're able to synchronize our minds in a moment-to-moment way. And you can see that in the brain.
Interesting. That is fascinating. The mind's eye, being the conductor perhaps of, these different kind of systems of your brain so that, hey, I need you guys to, make a picture of a shoebox and you guys make a picture of a paperclip, and then you take this paperclip and put it inside the shoebox and see if it fits, and then, you know, so there's definitely a lot of that that may be going on, and it's amazing to see the studies kind of happening and us learning this as a civilization, as a society, you know, at this point in history. So very amazing stuff.
Are useful tools to see that.
Yeah. It's amazing that we are at that point where we do have the ability to actually measure these things, because like otherwise it would really just be a bunch of conjecture and hearsay and, you know, happenstance and stuff like that. So moving on to the next question, and thank you to everybody that's already in the chat. Peace to all the ITs that are in the chat as well. So do you have any favorite MC storytellers or story verses from hip hop that you could, you know, share with us right now?
Yeah, I would say, hands down, the best story, verse, or track in terms of like hip hop would be Andre 3000's "A Day in the Life of Benjamin Andre." That song is, I think, like peerless. It's incredible. It's just like really, first of all, when you're rapping, it requires you to like convey meaning while still adhering to some kind of rules of like rhyming in a certain way. So you can imagine that that would like hamper your ability to convey meaning. Like if I'm trying to tell you something and I have to rhyme to tell you the thing, then I'd have to kind of like shape my meaning to rhyme, and you might imagine that you'd lose some of the meaning in the process. But I've never like heard anyone rap about and be so clear in terms of and expressive about what they mean and feel so unencumbered, like Andre, like he did in that song. And he also like conveys a story. He describes like a life of this person that he insists is not him, but's probably related to him, and goes through a whole story. And I think that was probably the most powerful one. But a lot of rappers and hip hop artists use narrative. It's not, I wouldn't say it's like characteristic of everyone, but it is like a big part of it. So for like Blue, I love,
I love Blue.
Blue in Exile. Lauryn Hill does a great job of using narrative in her stuff. And like Nas is somebody who does that quite a bit. Those are some people in general that I would say. But Day in the Life of Benjamin Andre, top verse in terms of.
Y'all go check that out. Y'all go check that out next as soon as you can. It's probably on Spotify, probably on YouTube, probably on all the different streaming platforms. Go check it out. So in your studies, you measure how much listeners are transported into alternate worlds by different stories. So can you explain what that means and how you do that?
Sure. So transportation is a term that narratologists and psychologists use to describe the experience immersed in a story. And it's a metaphor. Think about it. It's the idea that someone who travels from point A to point B, not only did they leave point A to go to point B, they have somehow been changed in the process. And that metaphor is kind of what this is why they use that term to capture the effect of being immersed in the story, with the idea that like if I was reading a story or watching a movie right now, I would, if it was a good story and I was in the mood, fall into that story world, and I wouldn't be seated here anymore. In terms of like my mind, I would really be in the world of the story. And then upon my return, I am slightly changed in that I have now come back from this story world. So that's kind of the idea of transportation and narratives. And that's measured typically using surveys. So psychologists' bread and butter is using surveys. So people have come up with questions that they validated to kind of tap into this idea that people are immersed in stories. And there's a bunch of psychologists who develop these kinds of tools. So I use those kinds of tools in my studies. But in addition to that, I'm really interested in kind of finding beyond self-report changes in how people behave and think, using measures that are not really directly asking them, but maybe kind of consequences that you can kind of measure that change when you are immersed in a story. And one way I do that is using free association. So I have people type, because most of my experiments are online, so I have people type words, whatever words come to mind before and after reading a story. And what we find generally is when people are really immersed in a coherent story. You can see that the story themes persevere into their spontaneous thoughts after reading it.
Wow.
And that's not there, for example, when you scramble the order of the sentences or order of the words. And what that implies is there's something that's important about the coherence of stories and being immersed in those story worlds that leads to this change in the kinds of thoughts that come to mind.
That's,
So,
man, this
yeah.
is all great stuff. So you were gonna say?
I was just going to say that's like a way of tapping into this transportation thing. Back to your question, it's measured using
Right.
survey by asking people, but also, in addition to asking people, you can kind of start looking at the consequences of that. Like what changes in how people think in addition to asking them. And there's a lot of example looking at if attention starts shrinking or growing, they're more likely to be distracted if something popped up on a screen when you're immersed in a story or not. And these kinds of like cognitive consequences in addition to just asking people. So these are the ways that you kind of titrate and measure narrative transportation.
Got it, got it. And it's interesting too that you mentioned like, you know, the viewer, the listener, the receiver of this story being transported when, you know, one of the things that we talk about in this metaphor of life as a freestyle is that it's very similar to this idea of life as a journey. And we talk about, you know, I think somebody even mentioned it in the chat, like Joseph Campbell's, you know, Hero with a Thousand Faces, or just this idea of the hero's journey, and taking that and really, you know, seeing that the hero's journey also is a transportation of the hero from the regular world to kind of like this adventure world, and then at the end back to the real world, the home world again. And so it's very much like, let me guide you through this story and put you in the role of this hero, so that you can kind of be transported, and then back, you know, once this movie is over, everybody gets up from their seat and, you know, goes back to the real world. So it's there's a lot of synchronicity there between, you know, the writing of a story and or the telling of a story and the actual transportation that you're saying is happening for a person cognitively. So yeah. So sometimes stories or lyrics aren't very clear, and it's because they maybe that they're heavy with metaphor or ambiguity. So how can ambiguity and or metaphor affect one's experience of being transported?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's some of this, usually by the people who like develop these surveys of transportation, for example. Melanie Brock is somebody who did this work. And the finding is that stories that are more rich in metaphor, that are kind of like high literature, that are hard reads, tend to be ones that don't easily transport people. Or other kinds of stories, for example, or you think about like pop kind of stories, those ones are able to really grab our attention and immerse us in the story world. So I think sometimes when you have essentially lots of metaphor and lots of analytic kind of thinking involved in the story, that tends to be less immersive in general. But for the people who are experts enough and who are attentive enough and put enough effort into it, those people, then they can also be transported. It just might not happen as readily or easily for everybody.
We have a question in the comment, MRFRST, I don't know if that's Mr. First or not, but it says, I wonder, when people are transported, where are they transported to? Are they less sensitive to the world when transported, or more sensitive in some ways? And I'm not sure if they mean the world that they're transported to or the world that they're transported from, but either way.
I think I get what they mean. I think the question is kind of like when you're transported, or are you less sensitive to your immediate surroundings because you're transported into this alternate world? And there is actually some work on this. I think it's fairly new, like within the past few years. Some people were looking at visual attention during movie watching. So like if you would be more attentive to, I think there are like little distract things that were popping up at different points of the screen. And they also looked at, brain activity in like areas that are of your brain that are important for visual attention and vision. And essentially what they found, I believe, is that periods where you're really immersed in the story, you're less likely to be affected by these little perceptual distractors, these little things that are popping up, both in terms of behavior and I think also in terms of the brain, suggesting that when you're in a story, you're actually in the story. You're not you're not in your seat and you're not looking at the screen of your computer. Instead, you're in this world that you kind of have created in your mind based on the content that's in front of you. And that's like it's more than just the metaphor of transportation. To some extent, it's true. You're less sensitive to external stimulation, to external distractors when you're immersed in the story.
So it's kind of like astral traveling when you sleep, perhaps, if that's a thing that is actually verified by cognitive science at all. It's one of those things where when you're dreaming, or when you're in a sleep state or in a more kind of sedated state, you have the ability apparently to kind of intentionally travel into a spiritual realm or some other form of realm that seems real enough so that when you're there, you're actively participating in that environment that you're traveling to. So that may be something that we are doing in a very reduced way while we're actually consciously aware of our surroundings in terms of being in a movie theater or in terms of sitting in front of our TV or what have you. We know that we're sitting on our couch. We know that we're awake. We know that we're alive. We know that we are in the location that we are, but we, like you said, are transported in such a way that we are voluntarily kind of putting our brains, our minds inside of that story, metaphorically, or like you said, even possibly, just cognitively, which is real enough to us, right? So definitely.
Yeah, I think the way I like to think about it is that stories are particularly immersive. We have information. When I, read an article about something, or when I don't know, am looking at a recipe, I don't fall into it in the same way that I do when I read stories. And for some reason, stories are really immersive and expressive in our minds. They are entirely concentrated into text on a screen or a movie on a screen or, something that you hear from a friend in conversation. Those are entire worlds, and you have windows into them for a moment, and you can kind of fall in. And it's a really interesting thing about our minds that we can do that. And figuring out how is the interesting for me.
Yeah, and learning, how to do that on cue. And proactively, perhaps, maybe even without a story being something to kind of guide us into it, but just, again, going back to maybe astral traveling or even just meditation, you know what I mean? Like kind of putting yourself in a position where you're not allowing the outside stimulus to be in control of your cognition. You're allowing your either internal or some other kind of draw to kind of take you out of that space and put you in another space that allows you to just like be somewhere else. So very interesting stuff. I'm glad that this stuff is being studied, and I appreciate the work that you're doing for sure. As we continue on, so we definitely have like probably 1,000 bars by now. I don't know. You've already given us your take on the metaphor life as a freestyle, but you view things through the lens of stories. So what do you think about the metaphor life as a story? We kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but are the two metaphors compatible?
Yeah, I think first to answer the question about is life a story? Life is a story, to kind of get at that first. I would say that to some extent, yes. When you like our experience in our day-to-day, just say you go for a walk down the street, that is not a story. However, when we remember it or understand it, as soon as it kind of like is filtered through us, then you can kind of see how it becomes more story-like. Like if we were to walk down the street and then you were to ask me how that was, what I would tell you is my description, my interpretation, that experience filtered through me. And that tends to have more of the shape of a story in that it has some kind of causal events. It has like a character and their experience and how those causal events led to a change in what that character, what that person was feeling. So I think to the extent that we understand our experience, that part of life is story-like, I think. So not that everything in our world is a story, but instead a lot of things that go through us or filter through us become story-like on the other side, if that makes some sense. So that's kind of what I would say about the metaphor of life as a story. In my mind, it's how we interpret our world. We make sense of complex experience in certain ways, and stories are extremely complex experiences that we are able to readily engage with and manipulate and produce from a young age. So it almost maybe reflects to some extent the shape of how we understand information and our lives are a version of that. So that's something that motivates me. That's something I'm really interested in scientifically to kind of be more precise than what I'm waxing poetic about right now, be more precise about what that actually means. But that's what I would say about life as a story. And in terms of how it relates to life as a freestyle, I think the relationship would be, I think they are compatible. And it's the idea that we make sense of our experience using these, we chunk things into bits that make sense to us.
Right.
And our memories of an experience, our interpretations of an experience are not the experience itself. What they are instead are some recombination of the chunks that we kind of use to chunk up and parse the experience. And freestyling is a matter of taking those pieces, recombining them in interesting ways. And stories and interpreting is a process of kind of filtering our experience and making sense of it using the chunks and pieces that we have. So I think they relate at that point.
Yeah. It's kind of like the game of telephone, right? You hear one story at the beginning of this game of telephone. It goes down the line, such and such said this, and this is what happened. And then by the time it gets to the end or back to the original person that told the story, it's an entirely different story because we take those chunks, and sometimes we add chunks, and sometimes we remove chunks. And it's just like, well, you're not keeping the original source material pure, but you're flavoring it with enough of your own personality so that when the story gets relayed, there's a signature on it, And so
because we participate in that experience. It's not like we're some vessel that can just hold it as it is. By virtue of us holding it, by virtue of us understanding it, we shape it and change it. So it's totally related to what you're describing.
Definitely. Okay. What is the relevance of community when listening to or telling stories, and does the same apply to a rhyme cipher?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing. When you think about the way I study stories, at least, is to some extent not very community driven. What I do is I have a story and I show people the story, they read the story, or they watch the movie and they do some kind of cognitive things. It's pretty individual in the sense that I give them a story and they're just doing a task about it. However, if you think about it, what's the point of a story? Beyond simply understanding experience, that part of it is that, but also it's by virtue of taking an experience and putting it into a shape that we understand, it also becomes more communicable, a better shape for me to take that experience and convey it to you. So I think stories are inherently, to the extent that stories are communicative, to the extent that they are really useful and effective tools or vehicles for conveying meaning across people, that is the basis of community. The basis of me understanding what you're going through, you telling me what you're going through in a certain way or form that makes sense to you could be more story-like. And if that's more story-like, if stories are kind of about the shape in which information is best communicable across people, then I think that's a building block of community. And ciphers, I think, are, in some sense, to me, they're more of the kind of building off one another based on the kind of communicative in the way that I'm expressing, but I feel like ciphers are not so necessarily in my experience, focused on conveying coherent meaning across people.
Right.
Like it's more so, there's like a distinction, an interesting one, I think, between flow and flow in the like rap sense, like when you have some kind of cadence rhythm that you're maintaining, and passing that on to someone versus like me taking a message with meaning and conveying it to someone else in the cipher. In the cipher, I don't know if it's always bent on conveying meaning from one person to another. Maybe you can add on to that if you have something to say there.
I mean, I'm not necessarily the cipher rapper per se. I've had a little bit of experience with it, but I'll say that I would say there's probably less, less of a common thread going between different rappers' rhymes when they're in a cipher. And it's more like a relay race. It's more like I'm going to hand the baton off to you, and now you take it and do whatever you're going to do with it. And when you hand it back to the next person or back to me, I'll take it and do what I do with it. But we stay on beat, we stay on rhythm and all this kind of stuff. So there's the rhythm and the nature of the sharing is probably more, what's common between that exchange than the actual narrative itself. So, but I will say this is a great opportunity for anybody that's listening, anybody that's watching. If you're a rapper and you've ever been in a cipher, maybe take the opportunity next time you are in a cipher to build on the narrative aspect of what it is that somebody passes on to you. And it does happen for sure. It definitely happens. And when it does happen, sometimes it tends to happen on the handoff. Like a rapper will speak to the last couple of things or the last rhyme scheme that their last rapper said, and then build upon that and make their own thing. But in terms of like an actual narrative thread, that is definitely something that I think would be more innovative in terms of how ciphers actually work in modern rap ciphers. So there's an opportunity there, but it's probably not as common as it just being kind of a thematic kind of rigmarole, if you will.
Totally. And I think that's an interesting distinction because I was thinking just more generally about how stories figure into rap. And it's not always so narrative. Like, for example, you have structure that you can rely on in terms of rhythm, rhyme, and flow. Like when I think of like someone like Doom, for example, MF Doom. Doom is like an incredible rapper, great flow, however, it's not always necessarily so narrative. Even some of his lines don't always make the most sense, but like he like is able to still carry some general theme throughout the whole verse or the song. Right. And that's
he kind of paints murals.
Yeah, and there's
that aren't necessarily stories, but they're like just these kind of juxtapositions and these kind of like these like. In this corner, this is going on, and maybe there's a thread to the next corner, but it's not necessarily related, but I'll just put it all together anyway as a mismatch because I'm just dope like that, and I can do that. But if you stand back and look at it as a mural, then you can kind of get the whole kind of breadth of it all, and maybe it starts to make a little bit more sense, or it's more beautiful, or whatever. But yeah, definitely not, like you said, not narrative point A to point B to C to D down the line.
And maybe the distinction is that like not all meaning is narrative, in that like you can have themes and you can convey ideas, but maybe it's not necessarily narrative per se. But the extent to which then I take that canvas that you've painted and make sense of it to me and then convey that to someone else, maybe that becomes more story-like in shape.
Yeah. And ambiguity has benefits to it in the sense that, if the listener is interpreting something novel to what the storyteller intends, then that adds meaning on to the original piece. And then, you can say, well, I didn't intend for it to be that way, but if you want to add that, then let's do it. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that adds to the cultural value of something. When people can kind of add in meaning and value on top of that. So definitely. We have about 12 minutes, so I think we got plenty of time to round out these 16 immediate questions that we have, but we've definitely probably hit maybe quite a few at this point. I want to count just because I want to do the 16, but it's like, it's
Sure.
a freestyle, you know what I mean? Like, as long as it's significant, then it don't really matter how many bars it is. Like, counting bars
Yeah,
is kind of played out.
I feel like in ciphers people don't hold to 16 bars.
Nah, nah.
Typically.
So how do stories change our brains? What are the long-term effects? And does the same apply to music? Does it also have long-term effects on how it changes our minds?
Yeah, that's a good question and something that I've been thinking about a little bit in terms of the lasting consequences of reading stories. So I was telling you a little bit about some of the work I do where I have people read stories and you can see that there's like this, if they're reading something coherent and we get them to free associate before and after, you can see this like lingering of the story themes. So essentially the themes of the story seem to have some kind of gravity. And your spontaneous thoughts, you're just like stream of consciousness fluttering around, but it seems to keep being pulled back to like the core themes of the story. So that's something that I think stories do really effectively, that they're able to like just perseverate in our minds and act as like these kinds of like gravity wells that just pull our thoughts towards them for sometimes hours, days, even weeks after you read a really compelling story.
And like you said, worlds, universes, right? So, I mean, what is a planet but a gravity well, really, right? So if you're kind of having a gravitational pull towards something, then maybe you can inhabit that thing that is pulling the gravity on you. So, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It's no, no worries. So it's like they have this ability to really shape our thoughts for some time, even after they end. And in terms of our brain, I'm really curious about like what the neural mechanisms are behind that. What parts of the brain are really contributing to that? Is it these DMN areas, these default mode network areas that I was mentioning before that really seem to matter for the synchrony of meaning in a story? Is it those areas that seem to maybe show some continued synchrony across people even after a story ends? Or maybe is it like other parts of our brain that might be more associated with memories that just kind of keep popping other related experiences into our minds even after the story ends? So understanding and probing what the neural base is, the brain base is of this kind of behavioral effect that I'm finding this like lasting influence with the story. But if we can measure brain activity after, then maybe we could get a better handle on what these changes actually are. So I would say currently it's like something that I'm actively curious about, something that I really want to look into, but I don't have necessarily the most concrete thing or answer to give you.
Okay, that's quite all right. Keep on doing that work. So you study situation models, which are mental representations of what stories are about. So how would a situation model for lyrics differ from that of prose, like a book or a movie?
Yeah, so I think this kind of comes, so when people refer to situation models, what it's like our understanding of a situation, which is like usually something with people and like actions in an event, how certain events tend to unfold. A common example would be like, how do restaurant events tend to unfold? You go, you sit down, someone gives you a menu, like there's like a way that kind of event unfolds.
Gotcha.
And it like allows us to take this really complex experience and make it into a more tractable kind of shape that we can more easily understand and interpret and predict. But it's focused on situations, like how events unfold. And I don't know if, for example, like freestyling is always that, because it's not necessarily about like these coherent events and their sequences and how they're causally linked, but instead kind of like a weird cloud of thematic ideas and that you're bouncing around based on where you're at in your flow and where your rhymes are leaving you or taking you, what's opening to you there. And so I imagine that if there's like an important difference between how we understand events and how we understand ideas, concepts, and more of these abstract sort of notions, as opposed to like events that are more related to like a real experience unfolding in time. If there's a meaningful difference between these things, and I think there is, because stories are more like the situation, the events and experiences. And we have like other kinds of like concepts and ideas, and they're more abstract in that sense. So to the extent that they're different, I imagine that difference also is happening in freestyling too. Because when you're rapping, it's probably more like the latter. It's more like this diffuse set of ideas or theme that you're kind of inhabiting and exploring, kind of like at your own whim. You're not committed to necessarily telling a story when you're rapping. You're committed instead more so to adhering to your flow or to the rhythm, and then adding in whatever interesting meaning you can when it comes up. So I imagine that there's an important, meaningful difference in the mind and brain there.
Got it. Okay, so we've had guests on the show in the past that are computational artists and poets. In the last couple years, there have been impressive advances in AI-generated text and lyrics. What is your take on the role of machines in storytelling and music generation?
Yeah, I think it's really cool. It's super exciting that people are taking ideas and making like software and computational models, these actual kinds of formalizations of their ideas that they're making into programs that can then generate music, or like can generate text, or can generate stories. And the level at which they can do it now is actually a little scary. It's like there's these models, or these computational models called transformer models. One really popular one is called GPT-3. And what you can do, for example, is you can give it some text, and then it can like elaborate on it and generate alternate like endings. So if you give it a bit of a story, it can build and create a story maintaining the same characters it had in the beginning, and like tell some kind of story that's happening to these characters. And it's really impressive when you think about the fact that people have generated software that's able to do that. But the interesting thing is, I think, it's not that these programs necessarily know what stories are, because we don't really know what stories are. And it's more so the fact that we, as recipients of this kind of information, when we're presented with something that like can make sense, we make sense of it. So like so it's like a big part of I think the beauty and appeal is the fact that these programs are able to generate information that has a certain shape that we can take those like bare bones and build a world out of it. We don't necessarily need things that are presented to us to be perfectly stories coming in. We can make them stories from whatever they are. And as long as they have some of the pieces, we can do the heavy lifting. So I think there's a big part of maybe, I don't know if exaggeration, it's really impressive what they can do, but I don't think they're necessarily like, it's the fact that people understand how stories work and how freestyling works, that they're able to like create, like program that into some software and make it output that. But instead, they can generate some kind of pattern that has some kind of structure that we can see and elaborate on and draw meaning from, where we are kind of doing the heavy legwork to make it beautiful, to make it meaningful, to make it an alternate world. And I think these tools can allow us to better measure these crazy phenomena that we, our psychologists and just curious people, might be interested in. So I think it's really like a powerful thing that people are taking these ideas, expressing them formally in software, and making it generate art. But I don't think necessarily that they know what art is. It's instead that we can take things and make them meaningful and beautiful, or alternate worlds.
Right. Everybody always remember, software is a tool first. Always. Software is a tool. So last couple of questions here. A few years ago, there was a study from the University of Vermont which used computational methods to conclude that there are only 6 different types of stories. If that is true, is it that we are only capable of creating 6 types of stories, or understanding 6 types of stories?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I actually I didn't know about that study until kind of recently. I looked it up and I read it. It's really cool, first of all, what they did. They were able to measure the emotional response to stories, different stories over time, and characterize these kinds of different emotional arcs that stories tend to have. I would say that it's not definitive that like there are 6 stories and every single story that people produce are one of these 6. It's instead that like there's tons of stories. If you use these 6 shapes, you can kind of explain a lot of it. So it's not necessarily that every story is an exact replica of these shapes. And it's instead that like you can kind of see these shapes existing, expressed to different degrees in all of these stories. And that kind of complicates your question, because it's not that there are 6 forms and then we can only understand those 6 forms. But instead, it seems like what I would say is like there's certain kinds of shapes that we readily know stories tend to have. So when we generate new stories, we kind of are also generating stories based on what we already know. And you can imagine that these shapes of stories that we know will influence the new stories that we generate. And there might be a shape that we can understand well.
Hey, I'm going to have to cut you off. I think